Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IntraCultural Podcast. I'm Missy.
And I'm Lucy.
We're two anthropologists that co-founded a DEI firm, Willing Observers. So the IntraCultural Podcast covers a range of topics. We answer common questions that can be better understood using the concept of culture. And today we are addressing the questions: in the wake of the US presidential election, is DEIB dead? What does the future of DEIB look like in the US and beyond under the next administration for the next 4 years? So we just thought we would take some small questions for our second episode. Just little questions.
And I really wanted Missy to say is DEIB DEAD, but she did not.
I refuse. There was refusal.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll take my small wins when I can get them. This was not one of them.
All of these questions, of course, just for background, right? They come from this very open and vocal pushback by conservative politicians and public figures against DEIB, which is part of the kind of the larger book banning, critical race theory, LGBTQ plus rights and trans rights pushback. But that has been in the news for a while, but this administration, through things like Project 2025, have sought to actually create policy against some DEIB programs and infrastructure, including potentially getting rid of the EEOC. So,
yeah, and Trump tried to do that, right? Or at least he did sign an executive order last time he was president, banning diversity training that targeted white men, especially that made white men feel guilty or generally bad. So I remember where we were when that came down. And to be honest, there was a lot of freaking out and a chilling effect, but ultimately at the time, none of our training did what the executive order said not to do. So it didn't really change our everyday work. So that's an interesting thing. I mean, I don't mean to say that Trump will not do really terrible things. He will definitely do a lot of terrible things for DEI, but it's also interesting how much of that can he do? What is actually reflective of DEI work generally, and how do we keep doing the work, right? Because Missy and I are not gonna close shop and go home. So what does that mean for us in the next few years?
right. So, you know, here, how does that impact us? How does that impact you? We have conservatives, Republicans that have won the presidency and both chambers of Congress. And of course, US policy can impact DEIB globally and multinational. So we're going to kind of address this topic by thinking first about, right, how did we get here, right? And then, moving from the premise that DEIB is not going to go away and that we're not going to close up shop, what is already being done in places that have, as Lucy said, right, responded to the 2016 executive order, or states that have already walked back DEIB programming, and then what can you do? And that's where we're headed today. So should we start with how did we get here? Republicans were elected by a multiracial, multi-generational coalition who wants to dismantle DEI. So why are we here?
Ah. Oh yeah, before we started the recording, I screamed very loudly and Missy's like, what's happening? I was like, oh, I'm getting ready for the conversation. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, who is this coalition? Are we talking about general voters, or are we talking about a specific coalition that worked with Trump?
No, so we don't have all the data yet, but this is just thinking about the exit polls. Like
Mm.
we're looking at exit polling. We have across the board the only demographic so far that really got behind the Harris campaign was Black women. Exit
Mhm.
polling so far shows that Black women voted across generations, voted for Harris Walz at 91%. But every other right demographic, it was like either at a close to 50% or 50 to 60%. So that's what I'm talking about is the exit polling and the voting blocks.
Yeah. I mean, everyone was really surprised. I think a lot of people, Democrats include, especially capital D Democrats, think that if you're a person of color, you're not voting Republican. And I think this has definitely proven them wrong. That's one thing. The other thing has always been the question of Latinos, right? Like, who's going to get the Latino vote? And the thing that makes me really annoyed at that question is that there's so much diversity among Latinos. So much diversity. Like, Latinos can involve Mexicans, Cubans, people from Nicaragua, people from, Panama. They're like literally Latin American countries are so diverse. And immigration to the US by Latinos is diverse. Some people come here with a lot of money, some people come here as refugees. So to just group everyone into one category and assume they're all going to be voting the same is such a flawed thinking.
I would totally agree with that. And I think that is also, kind of a vestige of how um, polling works, how this kind of demographic representation works in like studying politics and political voting blocks to begin with, which I'm clearly biased as a qualitative researcher that I think the way that we study democracy should shift a little too, because it doesn't take into account the on the ground lives of everyday people and the intersectional identities that they have.
Oh, yeah. Like people at my previous job, which shall remain unnamed, my boss introduced me to someone and said, "Isn't it interesting she's Mexican?" I'm like, "Why is it interesting?" "Because she looks white." And I was like, yes, correct. Did you not know that the Spanish colonized Mexico? The Spanish are white people. I said it in a much nicer way. I don't know. I think I still sounded condescending about it. But I was like, you are my boss. You should know these things. Then you should not talk about people in this way. But great. Yes. Also, Mexicans come in whiteness too. So I think, I totally agree with you. Uh, polling, how you poll for race, ethnicity, gender, all these things have their own challenges. But I mean, the data is undeniable. He got the popular vote across most demographics in the United States. So what does that mean?
Yeah. And so, we're there are some big themes that I think are important to recognize. I think you know, economic reality is one of them. Again, if we're thinking of measurement, like I keep hearing podcasts and listening to folks talking about how well the economy isn't that bad and it's doing better and look at these numbers, but that doesn't actually capture the actual experience that people have every day of trying to buy groceries and to move through the world and save and like move up in the world. And I don't think that that is always really understood and acknowledged, especially by big D Democrats, for sure.
I agree. These are the conversations that I was having with people back in 2016. I was like, there are serious economic issues and frustrations that people live, but everyone I was talking to was like, but how can you put that in front of, all these other issues? He's a racist, he's a misogynist. And I was like, yeah, have you ever been poor? I'm sorry, I really did ask that question because she was a liberal, upper middle class white woman. And it's like, I have been poor, and I can tell you, I can sympathize with other people of color who would put that as their priority because that means you're worried about your paycheck, you're counting pennies, you're worried about feeding your family members. Like, I have been there. My family used to get free food from church. Like every Sunday, my mom used to line up to get free food because she had 5 kids and one income. So, yeah, like people will vote for their self-interests when they feel like they are losing hope. And that's what's really sad, that that's where we are.
Yeah. And I think that, the pushback that always comes with that is that people are voting against their self-interest because this person is not going to actually improve their economic situation.
Mhm.
But if we're not creating a safety net through government programs, and two, we're not really explaining to people how government programs are helping them if they are, right?
Mm.
Because I know that in situations that my family members have been in, to access some of the programs that they need to access, they have to jump through 25 hoops and like tons of paperwork, and they're already overtaxed and they don't have the time to try to figure out this bureaucratic kind of cycle. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that need to
And they speak English.
right.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
there are all these things that need to be like addressed and improved rather than simply telling people that they're voting against their self-interest without really understanding kind of, what it is that they're going through and why they might be frustrated, not only with the economy, but with the government as it exists
Yeah.
currently.
And there's an element of gambling involved too, right? Like, you know what you're getting with the current presidency. Like, should you believe what the other one is saying? And maybe he does something different and maybe he doesn't. But at some point, you're like willing to risk whatever you have to get something else in return. So, I mean, Missy and I were having this conversation before. There's so many ways you can explain to people using logic and data and Project 2025 language, but ultimately people vote for how they feel, which is why they don't want to really talk about logic and explanations. And they're just like, well, this is what I'm voting for. And kind of end of conversation. So, yeah,
Mhm.
we're
And if
not in a good place.
no, and if they really feel like the government isn't significantly improving their lives, then also the rhetoric of dismantling it might seem a little more useful, right? Or because I that like so now everybody here gets to listen to me rant about it, but Lucy has heard it before, and my partner Eric, poor Eric, I just like go on and on about the infrastructure bill that the Democrats didn't pass, right? The
Mm.
one that would have actually established like pathways for more elder care, and that would have created more child tax credits. And these are things that people would tangibly feel that they could use, that they could access. And instead, there was all this, crowing over getting roads and bridges important, right? But letting all of the other infrastructure go,
Mhm.
that I think was a huge failure, and something that, Democrats promised and didn't deliver on in the last cycle, that would have made daily life a little easier for people.
I agree. And I think there's also an element of time. It's almost like, do you want to do it right or do you want to do it fast? That's kind of like what I feel is going on. Like Democrats, they have all this like uh, claim to doing things the right way and the ethical way. And Trump is just like, let's get it done. Let's, appoint all these people. Don't do background checks on them. Let's like, let's appoint Elon Musk to help us reduce, use his algorithm to cut jobs and just get stuff done fast. And so I do think there's an element of time here and how long people have been waiting for change, since Obama's campaign ran on change, right? We've been talking about this for so long. So to me, it's not, I had hope this time that Kamala would win, but I am insulated in California where everyone is like, of course, Kamala will win. But, I ultimately it's not surprising that there is such a huge disconnect between the middle upper class kind of mentality and everyone else. And I had said this before we started recording, but when it comes to DEI mostly is targeted towards white collar workers in corporate America. Very little attention is paid to like frontline workers, to labor, to minimum wage workers. Like that's very little is targeted towards DEI historically in that area. Like we have worked with companies who are interested in incorporating them, but a key tenet for DEI is upward mobility, career development, professional development. And there's huge biases in the United States that says like, well, if you work, flipping burgers at McDonald's, what kind of professional development do you want? Do you just want tuition for school? And so these are kind of, I think, embedded into the greater issues too with how we've thought about DEI, that if you're making the case, well, all these people of color don't care about DEI, that's a faulty assumption to make because a lot of people have no idea what DEI is because they work in jobs where DEI hasn't been offered to them.
Right. And I think that is, I think we would be remiss to like not at least mention the fact that Harris is a woman of color, right? And that there's still that part of, also the reason that we have the turnout we have and the election results that we have is complex, right? And so we're talking about certain strands of reasoning, but one of those strands of reasoning is still remains that power and political power and leadership is still very masculine and very white in the United States. And like whether it's covert or overt, it's still, I think, hard for some people to see women, right? And especially women of color in those kinds of leadership roles or associate it with leadership and power. And so to your point, like that's also an important reason why we need to not run away from DEI right now, but think about DEI more broadly, doing it well, giving folks access to it who might not have access to it, and creating the time and space for them to think about it, which is, much harder ask when people are just struggling to get by every day.
Yeah, correct. It is very challenging to suddenly become aware of how deep these issues run. And right before the election, I talked to many people who were not from the US and who were not voting. And I asked them what they thought about the election. They're like, oh, America will never vote for a Black woman. This is people who, are only have really been seeing America from the outside. They're like, you've had like dozens of white men presidents. It takes a lot to break a pattern like that. And I was like, no, 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 you're wrong. We Americans are, we're ready. No, no, we're not ready. And it's really sad. And I think, we've have a lot of colleagues in the DEI space who would have made this claim too, that it would be really challenging for a woman of color to win the presidency. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of things that made sense about her and why she was chosen, right? She a lot of people think she is progressive. She is not a progressive candidate by any means at all. So she really was picked because she was a middle of the line candidate that people thought could win Republicans over,
Mhm.
because her background in policing, in California, and her more conservative stances in California, which made her really unpopular in Oakland, where I lived quite a number of years, were supposed to make people more comfortable with her, from the right side of the aisle. So she was by no means at all progressive candidate. And I think people do ignore that,
Yeah.
because the last time, you know, Trump got a run for his money was with Bernie.
Right.
And Bernie was the most progressive candidate you've had, also a white man. So when you have so many kind of elements involved in a candidate, it's hard to tease them apart. But for sure, another white man would have done better. Also, a more progressive candidate would have done better, because people really are concerned. And if you don't have a good platform as an alternative, just fixing the current broken thing is not as appealing as here's the alternative. Right.
Right.
And I think that's one of the rhetorics that made Trump so convincing, was that he has a lot of alternatives, and he has a lot of proposed solutions for the problem, versus let's just fix things slowly over time and do it right. That doesn't sound as appealing. That's not catchy.
Right. And I think, like, as you like to point out too, and I think it is right, like, I sit down and like read all the policy platforms. I'm like, okay, I've read this entire document. I have read far too much of Project 2025, but thinking about these larger policy documents and these platforms, that this isn't what people are thinking about or responding to necessarily. Again, especially when they're just trying to get by. And I do like the idea of like the concept of gambling, right? You're kind of gambling a little.
Oh yeah, America's gambling right now. I read this article that was like America went back to their toxic ex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like, we just picked the toxic ex because we need to suffer a little more before we leave, I guess.
Right.
I know that sounds really bad. Sorry, we would not make dark jokes, but
No,
Missy and I are a fan of dark jokes.
no, we do make dark jokes, and that is that. Yes, yeah, that's or like America was just like, well, kind of sucks right now. Let's just do some roulette.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're addicted to the highs, even though the lows also really suck. Let's
Right.
let's
So,
yeah.
good. I transition us to like really thinking about, I think something that immediately we started getting questions as soon as the returns came in. Like, not are you
Yeah.
closing up shop, but kind of, are you closing up shop? Like, what
Oh
are
my
you
gosh.
like? Is DEIA going to go away? Is it really going to die? And so, the short answer is no, it will not.
Yeah, we're starting to see some of the same trends that we saw back in the last election cycle, which is that it's a lot of people are obviously freaking out in a positive way, because they're recommitting and reaffirming their positive, stance on DEI. So we had, really nice emails from clients who were like, we're, leaning into DEI, we're running towards DEI, not running away from it. So I think we're going to see a lot of the similar kind of corporate activism that we saw last time Trump was president. To what extent we see it, Missy has some, Missy was talking about maybe some companies will go underground. Uh, Maybe some will be more vocal, like Disney has been in Florida. But at least from my stance, I know in the last Trump presidency, there was a lot of coalition building that I think we need to make permanent. Like, we have a lot of people who really care about DEI, who want to preserve it and expand it. And it's going to be a challenge. It's going to entail re-envisioning what that looks like, because when there's legislation that tells you you can't do things one way, then what is the way you can do it, right? Like, doesn't mean that we just stop doing it. It means we just do it differently. And what I would like to happen is that we create the infrastructure to make this sustainable in the long term. So we're not just scrambling every time something like this happens, because I hate to break it to people, this is going to be our life for not just 4 years. This is just our life when it takes a long time to change culture, and it takes a long time to change people's mindsets and to learn how to be more inclusive and belonging, even for ourselves. Like, we need to change ourselves in order to change other people. And that takes a lot of work. So yeah, that's my hope. I'm hoping that we can create a foundation to do more sustainable work.
Yeah, but I think, the takeaway is no, it's not going to go away. And it's not going to go away not only because we have committed people, but because, whether it's corporations, whether it is nonprofits, whether it is educational institutions, anyone with any sense in leadership knows how beneficial and profitable and important it is to have a diverse and inclusive, right, organization, to have inclusive culture. And so it's not going to go away, but that does mean that you're going to have to pivot in order to do the work in places where it is being actively targeted. And so my guess is that we will simply see name changes, right? That we'll see some pivoting in that way, but that the work itself will continue to be done. And as a model for this, we can look at Texas and Florida, right?
Mhm.
Where you already see some pivoting around, right? You know, we don't necessarily talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but maybe we talk about civility, right?
Mhm.
Talk about politeness, maybe we talk about belonging, maybe we talk about culture. And this kind of shift in terminology is going to allow the work to be done. But just to reiterate, it is not going away, and there's going to be a lot more people who are leaning into it. So I don't think this is something that people should run from, but really think about embracing.
I think I totally agree. And, I do think any attempts by Trump to quiet DEI trainings is going to be challenged as a First Amendment right. That's one thing. We could see a change in how many corporate contracts we as consultants can get or apply to. That is a possibility, that corporate work will be a little bit less than, corporate work will be more or higher than the contract in governments that we might be able to get as a consultant. And higher education, which depends a lot on state funding, might also see a reduction in what funds are available to use in DEI, right? So I think we are going to see some meaningful negative impacts. But to Missy's point about pivoting, this is where it's really sad, but we see more and more privatization of universities, and maybe there'd be privatization of DEI work and leaning into the sponsors, corporate sponsors, to the people who care about DEI for financial reasons as well as for academic ones, right? So I think we're gonna see a lot of shifts, and to some extent, we need to lean into these shifts, but also think creatively about what alternatives we want to see. I know I've written a lot about the business case and diversity, and Missy has too, on corporate activism. It's a little sad that we have to rely on the business case for diversity so much to get us through federal attempts to dismantle diversity. But this has a long history that goes back to like 1930s, even before then, of these challenges. So this is not a new thing at all. And what a lot of activists would say to that is there needs to be more coalition of working class, multiracial, multi-generational that propose alternatives to what we're currently seeing. And I am absolutely 100% in support of that. I don't think there is one solution that will get us out of here. We need all the possible options on the table.
Yeah, and I will like just double down on that and say, two things. One, I think when we're thinking of coalition building, that we can also think of something that you hinted at too, is that, you know, we can think of it organizationally too, right? Maybe academic institutions, right, rely on private corporations who can be doing the work, but also nonprofits, right?
That's
This
true.
is the time for us to like really think about coalitions at the organizational level too, so that if an academic institution that gets state or federal funding can't say or do certain things, they might partner with a local nonprofit that would allow for those things to also, right, still happen, whether it's training, whether it's like certain kinds of infrastructure. You can, again, think creatively, and these are the kinds of creative coalitions and that are necessary in these moments, and that historically, as to Lucy's point, happen over and over again. And I think the second kind of big thing to think about is like historically in the United States, there have been major federal movements against, like in the 20th century, against the LGBTQ plus community. And in those moments, sometimes it was corporations that led on extending rights and worker protections to the LGBTQ plus community when the government was actively attacking, right?
Mhm.
So not just one sector, but coalitions between sectors, and right, knowing that there are opportunities to do things in these spaces, and that we can lean on and draw from that history in order to think about moving forward.
Correct. Yeah. I do think it's instead of seeing it as a moment of, you know, implosion and closing in, like let's try to think in a way that it gives us hope, which is thinking about all the potential different strategies that we can employ. And I'm a fan of alternative economies based on where I was trained and who I was trained by in grad school. So, bartering. Go back to your bartering days and trade things with people for other things. Like recently, we've been talking about having a partnership where we trade our skills and our DEI learning in exchange for what they can offer us, which in this case is like more publicity, more connections, more networking. So think about what you need and what other people's have that they could offer without necessarily, relying on monetary funds. You can think about exchange of services too. I
Yeah.
just want to give a shout out to my sister who is feeding me coffee. So my mug has changed. She just came in and dropped me coffee. I was like, oh my God, you are the best. So I didn't get to tell her that when I turned over to look at her. So I'm now telling it on the recording.
No, I think though that's so, you know, is we've been kind of around it, right? But is DEI dead? The answer to that question is no, right? Um, we've talked a little bit about what some of the impacts might be. And uh, I think we've kind of settled on thinking, you should not feel, you can feel any way you need to feel, but when you're ready to take action, coalition building in whatever capacity that might be within your own communities, whether it's like thinking about connecting organizations, because you're going to have people doing this work all over the place, and connecting them is going to just be really important so that everyone has access to the resources that they need. We also have some folks that we're talking to that are creating like, right, Discord, right? So like
Uh-huh.
just, this is a scary time, right? Not to put that aside for certain communities. Here I'm thinking specifically of trans communities. And so it is scary. And so we do need that kind of on the ground organizing. So we have to think kind of at different levels for not just thinking about, right, thinking about first what we need to do for triage, right, to make sure that
Mhm.
everyone is safe and has what they need. And then we can start thinking about then, right, coalition building in different ways, organizationally and otherwise. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And when that Discord channel is up and running, we'll put it in the comments to the episode. And this is a great time for a plug. Missy and I and Dr. Melissa Vogel and Erica Vogel are putting together a network of people who are DEI professionals that use culture, ethnography, to do their work. So also we'll put that in the comments once we make some progress on it.
Yes, and so feel free to reach out to us if you are someone that centers culture, does ethnographic and qualitative methods, and is thinking about or working in DEI spaces. Uh, you know, Community and coalition building is important, and we're building our own community. So please do reach out. Uh, I think those are kind of our big points.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we kind of alluded to but haven't talked in depth about is the shift that we've seen with between DEI and culture. We've seen a lot of organizations before the election start to make this move, especially in the states like Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, more conservative states that have gotten some version of anti-DEI legislation passed. And one, or not passed, but have been, it has been discussed. One of the things that we are seeing is companies changing, or one, either they're merging DEI under people and culture. That's become a really interesting trend, which actually takes us back decades. I would like to mention that because DEI struggled so hard to become its own separate thing outside of HR. So that is a best practice, keeping DEI outside of HR. And in the last few years, there's been a return to putting it under HR. So that's been one challenge that we've been consistently seeing. When you don't have DEI at the highest ranks of an organization, when it's subsumed under something else, you are not leveraging the true potential of using DEI in a transformative way for your organization, because it's not just an HR function. DEI is a tool, a platform, a perspective that can change your entire organization. So that's one thing that's not going in a good way. But the other thing we've been seeing is companies generally thinking about culture more strategically and focusing on the inclusion and belonging aspect. In addition to what Missy was mentioning, focused on civility. Other organizations are focused on civility. And so, for example, Missy and I are putting together a proposal right now, due tomorrow, LOL, uh, for a huge belonging training. So that is the B. I made a joke yesterday to Missy that the B hasn't been under attack yet. It's only the DEI. So maybe we run with the B for a little bit longer. But I think, all the discourse around which terms to use and how to use the terms is going to become highly more important than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I guess just thinking about that as well, like I I think like what happens, we're very like focused on what's happening in the US, obviously, but just to the point that like what's happening in the United States can impact multinational corporations, can impact and will impact, like have global impacts because of the US's foreign policy and their perspective on folks that they like to marginalize over and over again. So I think that this also, like the coalition buildings that's happening, right, at all these different levels, right, within your community, building capacity, right, between organizations, connecting, building capacity. We also need to make sure that, right, as folks that live and work in the United States, that we're thinking globally, because we need to be building capacity globally as well. So that when we're thinking about inclusive culture, right, that we can think about how those coalitions internationally as well can help support this work more globally, where we need to address issues, and right, how the United States change in policy and practice and administration impact us more broadly.
That's a really interesting point. With the multinational corporations, because the World Economic Forum and the UN have pro DEI stances. So if you haven't read them, they're very interesting. But as opposed to the United States, which is about doing DEI because it's good for business, a lot of these international organizations promote DEI because as a means to address discrimination in the workplace, which is more in line with the affirmative action kind of modeling of the US. But it will be interesting to see, how do US companies get impacted by these international agreements and these and the national laws of their own country. Because, if you have done global DEI reading, or if you're not familiar with DEI in other countries, you still have to abide by those laws. So for instance, with LGBTQIA, trans, specific anti-trans legislation, companies working in those states might not be able to do as much work on that state when it comes to promoting LGBTQIA rights and benefits in the workplace. But there is a lot of activism around how do you circumvent laws that are discriminatory in order to create a healthy workplace. So I will be very interested to see how we can use some of those international contexts to learn from them and see what we can do here in the United States, because other states have been leading on this. Other companies in other states that are against LGBTQIA rights have really done some creative work in that area.
Yeah. So I think, right, what can you do right now? Build community in whatever spaces you're in, right? Locally, right? Between organizations, internationally, and think about how we can build capacity, because DEI is not dead and we are not going away. Instead, we are leaning in, and we will be here fighting the good fight, whether we call it DEI or whatever comes next.
And what I would like to see that is multiple acceptance of approaches and strategies, like a plurality of strategic approaches to expanding DEI, because I think we can be our worst enemies in critiquing some ways that people do DEI than other ways. And as long, I think, as we're thinking strategically how to create more inclusion, more belonging, we welcome the critiques, but also let's put on a united front and see how we could make some headway in making this work more sustainable for the future.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic place to end. So thank you everyone for listening, and we will be back with episode 3, where we'll do something really, really heavy again. No, I don't know what we're going to do next time. But good
We
luck.
have thoughts.
Yeah, good luck and happy organizing.
Yeah, see you soon. Until next time.
Bye.